The dense jungle of Guam hides a secret. For nearly 3 decades, an entire nation forgot one man, a single soldier left behind by history who lived in the shadows of war, unaware that the world had moved on. The island was a battleground in 1944. Japan's imperial forces had held Guam tightly, until the relentless advance of Allied forces brought its downfall. But there was one soldier who never received the orders to surrender, one soldier who believed the war was still raging. His name? Shoichi Yokoi, the Japanese soldier who stayed hidden for 29 years after World War II ended. On the evening of January 24, 1972, a group of local fishermen stumbled upon something they never expected to find. A man disheveled and dirty with eyes full of disbelief. He had been living in the jungle, surviving on a diet of fruit and what little the land could provide. His rifle, rusted but still clutched tight in his hands, remained at the ready. But this was not the battlefront. This was the end of the war. Yokoi had refused to believe that the war was over. His orders were simple. Do not surrender. Do not give up. His duty was to protect the emperor, even if the rest of the world had already moved on. It's 1944, and the Pacific is ablaze. The Allies, driven by vengeance and necessity, are pushing Japan back in the bloodiest conflict the world has ever seen. The island of Guam, a strategic military outpost, becomes a flashpoint. Shoichi Yokoi was a member of Japan's imperial army, stationed on the island with orders to defend it at all costs. As the Americans landed, the Japanese forces fought tooth and nail, but the island's fate was sealed. By August 1944, the American flag flew over Guam, signaling the end of Japanese resistance. The battle was over, but for Yokoi, it was far from finished. As his comrades fell, Yokoi retreated into the dense jungle with 2 others. Their goal was clear: stay hidden, live, and fight another day. For a while they did. They evaded capture and maintained the delusion that the war was still raging, that help would come soon. But over time, his companions either succumbed to the harsh jungle conditions or were lost to starvation. In the isolation of the jungle, Yokoi clung to his belief. He survived by hunting, fishing, and foraging for whatever he could find. His daily life was marked by ritual, survival, and an unwavering commitment to his orders. He would hide during the day, only coming out at night to search for food. He even made primitive traps to catch small animals. Yet in the back of his mind, the certainty that the war had not yet ended never wavered. For nearly 3 decades, Yokoi remained hidden, completely unaware of the changes sweeping the world around him. While nations rebuilt, economies soared, and new generations were born, Yokoi's life stood still in the jungle. He was not just fighting the war anymore. He was fighting time, nature, and the reality of an ever-changing world. By the late 1960s, things had changed on Guam. The war had been over for years, but the island, now a U.S. territory, was transforming into a modern hub of American military might. Yet Shoichi Yokoi remained in his isolated world, the relentless cycles of nature his only companions. For Yokoi, the world had not changed. He still believed the war was ongoing, and each day, he lived by the same code that had been instilled in him in 1944. His survival was an endless struggle, and he had mastered the art of staying out of sight. The jungle became his battlefield, and the earth, his ally. He had no idea that decades had passed, no concept of the technological advancements, the political shifts, or the fact that the war he had fought in was long over. During these years, the outside world would occasionally intrude. American patrols and islanders would come near the jungle, but Yokoi stayed hidden. His rifle was his only connection to the world he had left behind. His weapons, once tools of war, had become relics of a battle that no longer existed. The most difficult challenge was not the physical hardships of jungle life, but the emotional toll. Shoichi Yokoi was living in a permanent state of fear and vigilance. He was alone in a jungle that had grown wilder around him, its dangers multiplied by time. Yet each day, he adhered to the same survival routine, never surrendering, never accepting that the war had ended. But the inevitable was approaching. In 1972, fate would intervene. On the evening of January 24th, a group of local fishermen, out on a routine trip near the coastline, stumbled upon the jungle's edge. And there, standing before them, was the man they could never have expected to see. A soldier from a war they had never known. Yokoi, still clutching his rusted rifle, appeared before them like a ghost from the past. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt, but his eyes, those eyes that had once held the fierce determination of a soldier, were now filled with something else. Confusion. He had been living, isolated for so long, that the concept of peace seemed foreign to him. At first, the fishermen didn't know what to make of this man. To them, he looked like any other person living in the wilderness, perhaps a hermit or a local with a strange story. But when they communicated with him, his words began to make sense. The war, he believed, was still on. This discovery, his discovery, was more than just a shock to the locals. It was a testament to the power of belief, to the strength of mind that can sustain a person when everything else has been stripped away. For Shoichi Yokoi, this wasn't just the end of a physical journey. It was the end of a psychological one. He had never been allowed to believe that the war was over. His entire reality had been based on survival, on duty. But now, reality was crashing down around him. Shoichi Yokoi's discovery was more than just the return of a soldier. It was the return of a man caught between two worlds, the past and the present. When Yokoi was taken from the jungle to the nearest village, he was introduced to a world that had changed drastically. The 1970s were a far cry from the 1940s he had last known. The streets, the vehicles, the technology, everything was alien to him. But what struck him most was the realization that the war he had fought so hard to survive, had ended long ago. For Yokoi, the shock of this revelation was more than just intellectual. It was existential. He had lived for nearly 30 years under the belief that his duty to Japan had not been fulfilled. But in the eyes of the villagers, his survival was no longer a triumph. It was a relic of the past. His first words upon being discovered were simple, but poignant. "I have lived like a beast." For Yokoi, the jungle had been both his home and his prison, and he could not comprehend the world beyond it. He was an anachronism, a ghost from a war that had been fought and won long before his return. The Japanese government, initially unsure of how to handle this extraordinary case, welcomed him home as a symbol of wartime loyalty. His return was covered in the media, and for a time he became a national figure. Some hailed him as a hero, a man who had held fast to his honor and his duty, no matter the cost. Others, however, saw him as a tragic figure, a man who had lost himself in the jungle, unable to reconcile the war with the modern world. The real turning point came when Yokoi was granted an audience with the Emperor of Japan. His meeting with Emperor Hirohito was a moment fraught with tension and symbolism. Yokoi had survived the war with one purpose in mind: to protect his emperor, to be loyal to the crown. Yet now, in this room, with the emperor sitting before him, the reality of his mission seemed almost absurd. The war was over. The emperor was not in danger. The world had moved on. In that moment, Yokoi was no longer a soldier. He was a man lost in time. The Japan he had known, the ideals he had fought for, had all vanished. His identity as a soldier had defined him for so long, but now he was faced with the painful truth. The war he had fought in was not his reality anymore. But in the end, Yokoi did not break. His sense of duty remained intact, even if the world had changed. For him, honor and loyalty were not defined by time. They were eternal. He was a man of the past, living in the present, but with a heart still bound to the ideals of a world long gone. Shoichi Yokoi's return to Japan marked the end of an era. He had been living in the past, and now, in the modern world of the 1970s, he was an anomaly, an echo of a time long past. Despite being hailed as a national hero by some, there was a sadness to his story. His survival, while extraordinary, became a symbol of a nation's struggle to reconcile with its wartime past. Yokoi was a man who had lived for nearly 3 decades in isolation, disconnected from the reality of a world that had moved on. Yet, in the end, he never let go of the very ideals that had kept him alive in the jungle: loyalty, duty, and the unyielding devotion to his emperor. The years that followed his return were filled with media attention, and Yokoi tried to adjust to the modern world, but he was never truly able to let go of his wartime identity. His story became one of regret. Regret that he had been lost to history, regret that his family had moved on without him, and regret that the war he had fought was now a distant memory for most of Japan. Shoichi Yokoi passed away in 1997 at the age of 82, but in his death, he left behind a legacy that continues to haunt Japan. His story is a poignant reminder of the power of belief and the human cost of war. His life, caught between two worlds, reflected the trauma of a generation that had lived through the greatest conflict in human history. In the silence that followed his death, the world remembered him not just as a soldier, but as the last of a generation that had been left behind by time. The jungle where he had spent 29 years hiding in secret now holds his memory as one of the last men who truly believed in the war. And though the world has moved on, in the silence that follows, the ocean remembers everything.